Why is the story of First Nations and Chinese contacts historically so important to tell right now? I think it's important both right now because of the changing nature of the province. I mean, the Chinese have been here since the first moments of, in fact, contact of First Nations people with people coming from other places in the world. So in 1788-89, for instance, when Captain John Mears tried to set up a fur trading station in Nootka Sound with the Nuu-chah-nulth peoples in the local area, the ship he came in on had a number of Chinese on board who were there to help him build a fort and to be laborers within this new trading post.
The status quo mainstream interpretation of first contact in BC being British, Spanish, and First Nation, that actually Chinese played a strong role in that by being aboard one of the ships and being forced to build the first Spanish fort in Nuu-chah-nulth territory.
So the Chinese were here right from the first moments that the British came. We don't really think about that when we think of BC history.
For too long, we thought of British Columbia history as being white history simply because it's white people have written the stories. But the proportions of First Nations people were very great. They were in the majority until certainly the 1880s, 1890s. And people from China were sort of 15-25% of the non-native population until the beginning of the 20th century. So these are not just groups at the margin, they're important groups in British Columbian history.
What I remember of the late Mary Jones from Pachidot in Port Renfrew explaining to me as a child, hearing stories that these people ate strange foods and ate bowls full of maggots. And to people that didn't know what rice was at that time, that's what a bowl of rice would look like to them. So recounts from elders about strange people or people that were strangers to this land that arrived. They weren't white, they weren't Spanish, they were similar in color to us and ate strange foods.
There was a phrase that was used in the anti-Chinese movements, and it was, the phrase was "White Canada forever." And what they meant was White Canada forever in the future, but they also meant White Canada forever in the past. So they erased a past where there wasn't a white Canada. So if there was lots of Chinese and First Nations people, well, that history didn't matter. It was basically ignored or erased. Immediately after the building of railroads, you had a series of anti-Chinese movements. And you also had, at the same moment, the clearing of native peoples from their lands. And so the two, in fact, went hand in hand. First Nations people were moved from prime real estate, you could say, from the best locations onto reserves. And so one of the things that I think is really tragic about BC history is how this very complicated society that was created, where Chinese and others from Asia that came across the Pacific Ocean were engaging with First Nations people and engaging with European migrants. Well, that became a white supremacist, white-dominated society as more and more new people came in, looked around, and sort of said, this is all ours.
The Chinese people and First Nations people reacted in a number of different ways to the relationships with each other. In some cases, they very much depend on each other. There are many, many stories in British Columbia history of First Nations children who the only real treat they got during the year were the oranges and the sweets from China that the local Chinese merchant would give them in a small town. And these are many people who have very strong, happy recollections through their life of the Chinese merchant who ran the general store, who's the one person who treated them as equals throughout their lifetimes.
One of the things that often many First Nations peoples, when they think about the Chinese in rural places in BC, often think of them as the local store owner or the local restaurant owner.
And interestingly enough, white women were not allowed to work in Chinese restaurants, so First Nation women were hired as waitresses and kitchen help. And First Nations also recognized that they weren't always welcome in white restaurants and society, so became a customer base for these restaurants and businesses. So it was a two-way relationship that started many generations ago, and I still see existing today.
So the Chinese were actually willing and wanted to engage with local peoples because they were potentially their future in-laws, they were customers if they opened stores.
A lot of Chinese men actually married these women in Christian ceremonies, which they did because the Aboriginal women were already converted. And so what you see marriage certificates where the husband is down as a Buddhist, the wife is down as a Catholic or an Anglican.
As years have gone by, I've come to understand more about some of the different intermarriages and talked with other First Nations people from other tribal groups across the province that have had similar experience, that there had been intermarriages and that there is evidence of more people of mixed Chinese and First Nations ancestry.
There are stories of Aboriginal men who told their children that the woman who was the housekeeper was a housekeeper when in fact she was also their mother. So there's a whole range of these kinds of relationships that existed on one side and on both sides, because there certainly are a lot of, there are First Nations people I know who have Chinese inheritance, which they're not quite sure whether they should be proud of or they should be slightly unproud of.
One of the sort of tragedies of the changes in laws that the British Columbia government made to give only certain people status, native status, was that it forced many of the Chinese and the sort of mixed children of Chinese and First Nations marriages, it forced them to choose where to live because the Chinese had no status, and so they couldn't live on reserves. They had no rights on reserves. And so often what happened was they had to leave, and leaving their families behind. Sometimes they took their children, other times they had to leave their children. And so people sort of have glimpsed histories of that, sort of saying, well, he left. So he left our family, he left our community. And often they don't know why these men left. Often it wasn't their choice. So I think there's been a kind of history of dislocation and disruption, which added on to things like the residential school experience, means that the history of many of these families is incomplete.
I think it's an excellent time to look at relationships between the two cultures historically from 150 years ago and beyond, and for the benefit of First Nations people, Chinese Canadian people, and mainstream society to know that we have had long-standing relationships between the cultures, past, present, and in the future.